Thank you. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm Stephen Fagin, the Associate Curator here at the museum, and I want to welcome you to another of our Living History programs to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. One of my responsibilities at the museum is to manage our ongoing oral history project, and we've recorded over 1,000 interviews with people from around the world about their memories of President Kennedy and the day of the assassination. And every so often, a unique storyteller emerges from this project, and we like to invite them back to the museum to do a program, and that's what Living History is all about. I'm sure many of you remember where you were when President Kennedy was shot, and you might like to tell your story as well. If you would like to be part of this tapestry of living history that we're building at the museum, please see someone while you're here today, or look us up on our website, jfk.org. If you live here in the Dallas area, we can do a videotaped interview with you. If you're visiting us from out of town, it'd be very easy to arrange a brief telephone interview, and you can be part of this collection as well. Just a reminder to please make sure your cell phones are turned off, and with that I would like to introduce our special guest. Today's Living History is with a distinguished journalist who spent over 25 years with the New York Times, but back in 1963 Wilborn Hampton was the youngest member of the United Press International UPI bureau here in Dallas, and he had been on the job only about 2 months when President Kennedy was killed, and he was thrust into history covering the story at Parkland Memorial Hospital and at Dallas Police Headquarters. So please join me in welcoming Wilborn Hampton to tell his story today. So Bill, you were pretty young when all of this happened, and I'm hoping that you can set the scene for us before the assassination. A month before, in October, you covered a very important event here in Dallas, which in many ways is emblematic of the political tenor of the time. So set the scene for us, if you will.
Well, yes, it was. It's important to realize at the time what the political climate in Dallas, or at least the political climate as it was perceived around the world. It actually began 3 years earlier. I'll just briefly talk about 1960, during the campaign when then running for Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who was the senior senator from Texas as well, and was running with Kennedy as his vice presidential nominee, made a campaign stop here in Dallas, and he was going to make a speech. And it turned very ugly. A group of people that were very opposed to Kennedy and Johnson accosted him and his wife as just before as he was entering the Adolphus Hotel to make his speech. These demonstrators were carrying placards, but it turned rather violent almost immediately. One person grabbed Mrs. Johnson's gloves out of her hand and threw them in the gutter. People crowded around the vice president, and they began spitting on him and on Mrs. Johnson, shouting epithets in their face, and it became, obviously it was covered around the world. There are pictures of this that were covered around the world, and it sort of almost immediately identified Dallas as sort of the capital of intolerance, of extreme right-wing hatred almost. And it's important to know, as I think everybody does when they think about it, hatred is by and large born of fear. And the thing that these people were afraid of, most of all, was communism. This is only a few years after the McCarthy era. Communism was feared and hated very much the way international terrorism is regarded today. This incident sort of made Dallas a magnet for a lot of very right-wing activists. General Edward Walker moved here. The John Birch Society was founded. And Dallas became, literally around the world, almost synonymous with extreme right-wing political views. So that by 1963, this hatred and fear of communism was the basis, was the linchpin on which this political movement, the Birch Society and the right-wing activists rallied around. Khrushchev was running the Kremlin, Castro was running Cuba. Communism was 90 miles off our shore, as they kept reminding us. And this fear extended as well to the United Nations, who became a point of evil. The United Nations had welcomed Castro to speak. They had welcomed Khrushchev to speak, famous speech in which he banged his shoe on the podium. So that by 1963, Dallas was pretty much identified as the sort of the capital of this right-wing, arch right-wing conservatism. And the UN, as I said, was also one of the targets. And Adlai Stevenson, who was then our ambassador to the United Nations, had been invited to speak on October 24th, which was celebrated as UN Day. And the night before, General Walker had given a speech as well, denouncing the United Nations and calling everyone. This group called for the United States to withdraw from the United Nations because the United Nations was fostering all these communists and giving them shelter. And on the night of the 24th, when Stevenson began to speak, a lot of Walker's people, supporters, his troops, were in attendance. And Stevenson had no sooner begun to speak than people at the back stood up and started shouting, "Liar, liar, you're a liar." They were carrying placards. Suddenly placards came out denouncing the United Nations, then waving them, and really disrupted Mr. Stevenson couldn't continue. I had attended this just on my own accord. I had actually been a great admirer of Mr. Stevenson, but I had been told at the office, I had only been working at UPI about a month then. I had joined at the end of September, been hired, and I was told, well, we have a copy of the speech, we have the story, but if anything untoward happens, phone in. And so I thought this was probably something untoward, and I phoned it in, and was told to stay on the story and to try to get a comment from Stevenson after it was over. And it didn't let up. Stevenson couldn't speak. He, at one point, tried to quieten the crowd, and he said, "Please, please, let me speak." He said, finally, in frustration, he said, "I did not come to Dallas to teach Texans manners. Please let me speak." And finally, the majority of the people that were there to hear Mr. Stevenson speak, and they started shouting back at the demonstrators. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, the police came in and they removed most of the demonstrators, and Ambassador Stevenson was able to finish his talk. But I knew at the end that I had to get a comment from him, or try to. So I went out a stage entrance, and sure enough, there was off to the left, there was a limousine with a door open waiting for him, and I figured Stevenson would come out, and sure enough, he did a short time later, surrounded by a phalanx of policemen. But the demonstrators were there as well. They had placards, and at one point, one woman reached over between two policemen and hit Stevenson over the head with her placard, and he was sort of stunned. I was sort of stunned. I was standing very close, almost as close to him, and I was shouting to him. I said, "This is Bill Hampton, UPI. Can you give me a comment?" And he was about to say that when the woman hit him. Then somebody else, it was a young student, if I recall. I didn't see exactly who it was, but somebody reached over and spat right in his face. And he suddenly went back like this, and he started to wipe it off, and then the police sort of ducked his head and put him in the car and drove off. This was on October 24th, 1963. And so this was the Dallas that was on the president's itinerary as they were planning at the White House his trip to Texas the next month.
And the city went to great lengths to make sure that the president was welcomed, and there was an enthusiastic crowd at Love Field and along the motorcade route. Bill, you didn't have an assignment that day. Tell us where you were.
Well, I was very much the junior reporter in the office. As Stephen said earlier, I was certainly the youngest there, and I'd only been on the job for 2 months. And despite the fact that we had mentioned earlier, but as many of you probably know, at that time UPI and AP were the two major news agencies in this country, and were fierce rivals. And at the time of the Stevenson story, the AP had not sent anybody there. So I had scored my first little victory as a cub reporter by having some eyewitness and some quotes. Even though I didn't get the quote from Stevenson, I did have a lot of eyewitness color that added to the story. So I had thought when the president was coming to town that, oh boy, I'm going to get to cover the president of the United States, at least while he's in Dallas. But that wasn't working out that way. Everybody in the office, covering a president in those days was very big news. You put out wild bulletins when the Air Force One took off and when it landed. Everything about a presidential visit had sidebars and separate stories. They'd put out a separate story on the menu for what they ate for lunch. They'd put out a separate story on what Mrs. Kennedy wore and what anything that was said, any little sidebars. I didn't get to do any of that. I was allowed to take dictation the previous day from Houston, from Merriman Smith. Merriman Smith was the dean of the White House correspondence at that time. He was the UPI's White House correspondent and dean of the White House press corps. And he was, everyone called him Smitty. I'd never met him, but everybody called him Smitty, so I called him Smitty too. And but I took some dictation from the dedication at the Space Center in Houston. They had previously been in San Antonio and went on to Houston, and then that night they flew to Fort Worth. And I thought, well, you know, everybody in the office was staying on overtime. They were going to be there till midnight. I was told that I could go on home at 5 o'clock, which was my usual quitting time. I was absolutely dejected, especially after what I thought I'd had a pretty good success covering Stevenson. So on the morning of on the 22nd, I came into office. My first task was to make coffee for the office. And I didn't really have much to do. And it was sort of a disappointment. But the president landed. It was huge. It's interesting that going into Dallas, one of the things that the president told Jackie, he said, well, we're heading into nut country now. Some of the White House had wanted him to drop Dallas after the Stevenson incident, as a matter of fact, but he insisted he wanted to come to Dallas. That morning there had been some ominous signs. There was a famous advertisement, which you can see when you tour the museum, accusing the president of treason, that had been in the morning news. But when he landed at Love Field, it was a different Dallas that greeted him. And it's a Dallas that I was more familiar with. I'm a native of Dallas, and when we were describing this small coterie of extreme arch conservative right wing, to use the words of the president, nuts, it was not a Dallas that I knew. We knew about, growing up, we had heard about General Walker, but he was just regarded, oh, he's one of those crazy birchers, or, you know, whatever. My family, most of the people that I knew, were not part of that sort of moneyed elite coterie of people that formed this arch-conservative group. But so he was met and he was greeted by huge crowds. There was a huge crowd at Love Field, and 98% of them were in support. There was one person holding a Confederate flag, and there was one person, I think that picture's also in the museum, and a couple of signs for him to go home. But the rest of them, everybody was glad to see him. As a matter of fact, the president broke away and went and shook hands along the way. And so back in the office, people were writing this. He had arrived at Love Field, and he was greeted by enthusiastic crowds, and the motorcade then left Love Field and was on its way to the Trade Mart, which was going to take, however, a parade route, the whole motorcade, through downtown Dallas on Main Street. And from Love Field to Main Street, there was sort of a lull in the office, and as the whole motorcade was going, it was a quiet time. People went and got a cup of coffee. They were sitting reading the newspaper. My boss, Jack Fallon, who was the man who hired me, actually, he was in charge of the Dallas office. And the Dallas office of UPI was the headquarters for a 5-state area known as the Southwest Division as well. And the main A-wire came through Dallas and in and out of Dallas. And so, shall we go on to?
Yeah, everything changed with just one phone call.
Everything changed. As I mentioned, there was this sort of quiet time in the office. They were just waiting for the president to arrive at the Trade Mart when this Chinese fire drill of activity would begin again, and everybody would be on phones and taking dictation and everything like that. But at this point, they were all sort of scattered around the office, and the phone rang. I was standing next to the news desk, and such was my relegation in covering this that I didn't even pick it up. I sort of looked around and thought that somebody else would answer the phone. It rang a second time. Nobody was moving to answer the phone, so just at the third ring, I picked it up and answered and said UPI, and the voice I recognized the voice on the other end. It was Smitty, because I had taken dictation from him, and the voice on the other end was screaming, "3 shots were fired at the motorcade!" I nearly dropped the phone. I grabbed it just before it fell out. I sort of screwed it to my ear. What I said next did not exactly recommend me for a future career in journalism. I said, "I can't hear you." It was a knee-jerk reaction to buy time. At the same time, I was grabbing a piece of paper and rolling it into a typewriter. I had heard him perfectly. I'm surprised that people out in the street hadn't heard him. He repeated again, "3 shots were fired at the motorcade. Make it a bulletin precede." So I rolled in, I typed the words bulletin precede, Dallas UPI, and 3 shots, and I suddenly was beginning to realize as I was typing exactly what he was saying, just verbatim, I can't do this, I need help. And Jack Fallon was standing about 3 or 4 feet away, writing on a telex machine. I won't stop to explain what a telex machine is. It's sort of like texting today, except it had to be a landline, and you dial somebody and you could type back and forth. There was a keyboard on a teletype machine. And he was talking to Austin about the plans for the president's arrival that evening. And I reached over and I was almost afraid to say it again myself. I said, "Jack, Smitty, he says 3 shots were fired at the motorcade." Jack said, "What? Give me that." And he grabbed the phone out of my hand. And I said, "I wrote this is what he's," and he was in 2 steps around to a typewriter, holding the phone, saying, "Smitty, what is it?" And Smitty, who thought I still wasn't able to hear him, shouted the same thing to Jack. He said, "Yeah, Smitty, we've got the bulletin, it's moving." He had given the paper to the teletype operator who was punching it into tape. I won't pause to explain all these tapes and things. We'll talk a little later about the difference in journalism, but and I felt absolutely crestfallen. I thought I had probably fumbled this story like a quarterback on the goal line. It felt terrible. Everybody else in the office had heard. They were grabbing phones. They were calling anybody they could think of, radio stations, anybody that might have stringers, anybody who might have somebody to find out any information. All we had was Smitty screaming 3 shots were fired at the motorcade. Smitty was telling Jack on the phone, I didn't know this, that apparently no one was injured. And the second sentence of the story was apparently no one was hurt. The reason Smitty was saying this is because the motorcade was speeding up and going along the motorcade route, the route that had been published. And suddenly you never know where these inspirations come from. Suddenly it just hit me. I knew the one person in the city of Dallas who would know what was going on. And I grabbed a phone and I dialed the police headquarters. And I tried to muster all the authority I did not feel in my voice. And I said, "This is Bill Hampton, UPI, give me dispatch." Somebody picked up the phone immediately and said, "Dispatch." And I said, I repeated, "This is Bill Hampton, UPI, what can you tell me about the shots at the president's motorcade?" He said, "Well, the president has been hit. There's blood in the back of the car. I just got off the phone with a motorcycle escort that was beside the president, and they're on their way to Parkland Hospital." And I paused for maybe 2 seconds. I should have had about 20 questions. And he said, "I've got to clear this line," and hung up. Well, all I had then was that the president's been hit and they're on their way to Parkland. And I shouted to Jack, "The police say he's been hit." And Jack didn't hear me. He's still talking. Another colleague, Don Smith, was there. And he said, "Jack, listen to Bill." He said, "What is it?" He was not particularly pleased with me at this point. And I said, the police say he's been hit. And he said, what police? And I said, the police dispatcher. He just got off the phone with a motorcycle escort, and they're on their way to Parkland. He said, the president's been hit. And Jack looked at me and he said, Smitty, what can you see? Well, I have to interrupt here briefly. Smitty was having problems of his own at that point. Telephones were rare in those days. You didn't carry them in your pocket. It was actually unusual to have one in a car. Police had telephones in the car, and the press sometimes had phones in the car. Well, this was the White House press corps, and they had a phone in the car. The first sound of shots, Smitty had grabbed the phone, and by virtue of being dean, he was phoning in. At this point, though, after he repeated 3 shots were fired at the motorcade about 3 times, because the money in the office couldn't hear him, Jack Bell of the AP was demanding the phone, the use of the phone, and trying to grab it out of Smitty's hands. Smitty sort of got down on the floorboard. He told Jack, they can't hear me, they can't hear me. So maybe I actually helped a little bit. The point being is that every minute that Smitty could hold on to that phone was another minute that we had a scoop on the story. Jack Bell at this point was almost crawling over the front seat. Give me the damn phone, give me the phone, and he was trying to reach it. But when Jack was talking to him, this is what was going on. They were fighting over the phone. And he said, Smitty, what can you see? Smitty managed to get up and look out over the window, and he reported back, we're passing the trademark. We're speeding past the trademark. So suddenly we knew they were not heading on the regular motorcade route. Fallon looked at me and he said, go to Parkland and report to Smitty. And I was out the door within 5 seconds, afraid he would call me back, actually. And I don't know exactly what happened in the office after that, but at some point, by the time the motorcade got to Parkland, Smitty had been able to talk to Clint Hill, and Clint had said, it doesn't look good, it doesn't look good. And Smitty had gotten in and phoned in, and UPI put out its first flash of the day that the president had been seriously, perhaps fatally wounded.
At Parkland, you were an eyewitness to the official announcement of President Kennedy's death. Assistant White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff, and that's this photograph right here, announced the death in a nurse's classroom. And Bill, you were there for that. Tell us about those moments.
I will, and I probably mentioned also how I managed to get there. I drove to Parkland like a bat out of hell, sort of. And by the time I got there, there was already a line of cars coming in front of the hospital. The people who had heard on the radio the announcement that the president had, by this time they knew that he had been hit, actually injured. And so I didn't know what to do. I pulled my car up on a median strip. There was a median strip in Parkland, and just left it there, and started running over to the hospital across the lawn. And when I got around to the emergency entrance, I was trying to find Smitty because my orders were to report to him, and but it was right at the time that Father Huber had come out. He had just been there and ministered the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church, and he came out and he said, there's conflicting reports now of what he said. He had been told not to say a word, and he insisted later that he only said that he was unconscious, but I was there, and he said something to the effect that it didn't look like he would make it, or it seemed that he was dead. And at this point I noticed, again, I have to remind you about phones. We didn't have phones in our pocket. Phones were vital. There was an old rule in journalism that day. You could have the biggest story in the world, but if you didn't have a way to get it out, a telephone, then it was the biggest secret in the world. And so I knew that phones were going to be a big problem. We had several hundred newsmen, and there were more coming. Well, at that time, I guess a little over 100, 150 newsmen, and only so many phones in the hospital. And I noticed a couple of guys, the White House people, starting to jog around from the emergency entrance, which is at the back of the hospital, around to the front. And finally, my youth stood me in good stead, and I easily jogged all the way past them. They were panting, running, and I was running like crazy anyway. And I ran in. I also knew Parkland, that there was a payphone in the lobby. And so I ran in and grabbed what the phone was free, and I phoned it in, and I can almost remember my exact words. I told John Smith, who answered the phone, that this priest said that he might be dead. And Don told me, he said, yeah, we've already got the priest. We've got the priest. Smitty phoned that in from the hospital. He said, you've got to find Smitty and you've got to work for him. Do whatever he says. But we're not going with the death officially until we get it from either the White House or the hospital. So then again, this was where I had a second inspiration. I have no idea where this came from, but it occurred to me, I remembered, that in those days the calling party had to hang up to break a connection on a telephone line. And also this payphone, as many did, had the number of that phone in the little, written in the dial in the middle of the circular thing in the middle of the dial. So I said, Don, look, I'm going to hang up. Call me right back at this number. And I gave him the number. I said, then you hang on to the phone, and then we'll have this phone tied up. So I hung up. Wait, 5 seconds later, Don called me back. I said, okay, all right. So Don tucked his phone in the UPI office underneath his chin, and he sat there for the next 5 hours with that phone. And anybody at Parkland Hospital who came and tried to make a call on that payphone, they were only going to talk to the UPI office in Dallas. So then I raced off. I hung up the phone and I raced off, and I was looking for Smitty. And about the time I was told that Smitty was down in the emergency area. And by the time I got to the stairs, there was a Secret Service agent there with a automatic rifle, submachine gun actually, blocking anybody from going downstairs. But I also ran into Preston McGraw, who was also one of the Dallas senior reporters. He was a veteran reporter. He had covered World War II out of London with Walter Cronkite. He was a great guy. He was had a deep Southern drawl. He was from Mississippi originally, and called everybody partner. So I went up and I said, "Oh, Mac, thank God you're here." I was afraid that all of this was going to be on me. Anyway, Mac was there. He said, "Hi, partner, how you doing?" I said, "Good. I've got a phone tied up in the lobby." And he said, "Good work, partner." He said, "I just saw Smitty. There's going to be an announcement here in about 2 or 3 minutes." So we waited there, and Smitty came in. I was finally introduced to him, and within a minute or two, Malcolm Kilduff came in with the hospital administrator and stepped to the microphone and made the announcement that President Kennedy died at approximately 1 p.m. today, Central Standard Time. And I took off running again like a bat out of hell. I tore down the corridor, and it's amazing to me that to this day I can even still remember other things of that day can some sort of fade and with memory become a little blurry at the edges. I remember that run as vividly as if I took it yesterday, and I grabbed the phone, and I even remember the exact words. I said, Don, he's dead. My God, he's dead. He's really dead. Don said, "Who, Bill, who?" And I said, "Kilduff, the White House guy." And I could hear Don then put the phone, cover the phone, and yelled at Jack, "White House, he's dead." And Jack then shouted to the teletype operator, who would then keyboard it straight into the wire, "President Kennedy dead." And I ran back, and we kept covering the story. That's all you can do. We started a relay. We were taking down every word that the doctors were saying about how they described all the procedures they had done to try to resuscitate him. And
it was a little bit later in the evening before you had a chance to really gather your thoughts and appreciate the magnitude of what was happening.
It is. It's very hard. When I was, at the time, something takes over, and you just keep doing the next thing, the next thing. I've read books now about people in the Secret Service that were downstairs. It was the same thing with them. They just sort of automatically kept doing the next thing. And when I was doing the book, my editor kept asking me, "Well, what did you feel? What were you feeling during all this?" It's an old journalist question. You use it to fill in anything. You ask somebody in the middle of a tragedy, something awful, what did you feel? And I had to tell her I don't know what I felt. I didn't feel anything. I just kept going, kept doing the next thing. And I was there at the hospital until about 5 o'clock that afternoon. And another little story is, remembering the day before, it was my quitting time at 5, and on any ordinary day, and I was scared to death that Jack Fallon was going to tell me to go home at 5 o'clock. And about 5 o'clock, I was called back to the telephone. Don's still sitting there at this, with the phone in his office. That phone in the lobby is UPI's private phone. And Matt came back and he said, listen, Fallon is on the phone. He wants to talk to you. And I thought, oh, this is it. So I went to the phone, and what he did, he told me, he said, get to police headquarters. They've arrested somebody, and they have a suspect. Get down to the police headquarters. There are a couple of other UPI people who were already there, but he wanted me to join them. And it was the first time that it really crossed my mind all that afternoon that someone had done this, that there was an assassin, that somebody had a gun and pulled the trigger and killed the president. Of course, I mean, it had to, as I say, things get a little fuzzy. It must have crossed my mind at some point. But anyway, then it came, of course, somebody did this. There's an assassin. And so I started running. My first thought as I went out the front doors with my car, I hope they haven't towed my car. If they've towed my car off that median, I don't know how I'm going to get to the police headquarters. I can't call a taxi. Anyway, I looked up and I saw my car still sitting up there. Wonderful old 56 Chevy. I wish I still had it. But anyway, I started jogging across the lawn. And there used to be, I don't know whether there still is or not, but there used to be a huge live oak tree out in the front lawn at Parkland Hospital. And it hit me. And I stopped by that live oak tree, and I just started to cry, and I couldn't believe it. This man that had been, especially for us, I was 23 at this time. I just turned 23 a couple of months earlier. Was gone. That all the hope that he had brought, all the joy, all the wit, just like that, is gone. And I sat there for maybe 20, 30 seconds, just really crying, tears pouring down my cheeks. And then I thought, I've got to get to police headquarters, and I wiped them off and ran on toward the car and drove into Dallas Police Headquarters.
Where you got your first glimpse of suspect Lee Harvey Oswald. We're going to take a quick look at a video taken around midnight on the night of the assassination during a very brief press showing of Oswald, so you get a chance to hear him, and then we'll hear what Bill has to say about the situation.
I really don't know what the situation is about. Nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that, and I do request someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir?
You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, we can't hear you back here.
Okay. What did you do in Russia?
How did you hurt your
Oswald, how did you hurt your eyes?
A policeman hit me.
300 members of the world press descended upon Dallas Police Headquarters, and Bill, you were one of them. What was that situation like for you?
It was absolute pandemonium. I've never seen anything quite like it. Reporters in Texas at that time were issued press cards by the Texas Department of Public Safety, and I had been given one about 2 or 3 weeks after I joined UPI. So as I walked into police headquarters, I took it out immediately. I knew I'd probably have to show it to somebody, and I walked around. There was absolutely nobody in the lobby. There was nobody to show my press card to. I could hear, if I had to ask where to go, I didn't really need to because I could hear noise, and I just started walking toward the noise, which was up a few flights of stairs, actually. And I put my press card back away and went in, and when I walked into the car door where all the noise was coming from, it was just absolutely jam-packed, elbow to elbow, like the New York subway at rush hour, with reporters. And they were more coming in all the time. Through the course of that evening, there would be planes landing, charter planes from London, from Paris, from Frankfurt, Germany, places from Latin America. The whole world was coming to Dallas, and they were arriving all that evening. And so I found one of my colleagues from UPI, and I told him I was there to help, and he said, well, good. He said, they've just charged Oswald with the murder of Tippit. And I said, who's Tippit? And he said, the policeman who was killed. I said, what policeman was killed? I've been at the hospital all this time. I didn't know any of this. He said, I better fill you in. So he took me in and he told me about the murder of Patrolman Tippett, and that they had arrested Oswald at the Texas Theater over in Oak Cliff, a theater I knew well. I was originally from Oak Cliff. And so we were there just waiting, and it got to be sort of a carnival. There would be the TV headlights. You have to remember that TV cameras had to be plugged in at that time. There was no sort of instant cams or anything like that. And there were huge cables, and you had to be careful. You could sprain an ankle just tripping over the cables, running all the way down the corridor. And all these journalists, you had to sort of go like this to get down the corridor. But what would happen is every time they would bring Oswald down to Captain Will Fritz, was the homicide chief, for questioning, there would be an elevator, and it was about from here to the back of the room, I guess. And he would walk down this phalanx of reporters, and everybody's shouting questions. I didn't even try. They were all asking the same question. You know, did you shoot Kennedy? Why did you shoot Conley? Lee, hey Lee, why did you shoot Conley? Hey Lee, where did you get the gun? Hey Lee, you know. And he was sort of ignoring them all, but he was clearly loving the attention, all the notoriety. This is probably, if we're looking for a motive, this is probably it. But he was clearly a little off. He would say things. You saw how he ducked and he said, the police hit me. Well, coming down, he would say odd things. He would duck down to the police, to the reporters, and he would say, I demand my hygienic rights. Tell them. I asked a friendly detective later, I said, what does he mean? We were reporting all this. Every time he'd say something, we'd go phone it in. But he said, well, he's been wanting to take a shower. We haven't let him take a shower. He would come down, call the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. He didn't have a lawyer at that point. He did a bit later, and it was just things like that. And I didn't shoot anybody, and it was back and forth. And sometimes he was just silent. At one point, and this is sort of a precursor of what happened 2 days later. The Dallas police at this point were already beginning to feel very self-conscious about this. Dallas, as we recall, is known around the world as sort of the hate capital of the world. Everybody, fringe people, right-wing people, though this suspect was quite the other thing. He was quite the opposite end. He was the other fringe. He was the left-wing nut. But the police were going to bend over backwards to accommodate the press of the world. They felt a collective guilt was already beginning to form at the highest levels of the police and, of course, of city fathers, everybody in Dallas, I think. And so they were going to make Oswald available to the press, and they tried to have this news conference, which lasted about a minute and a half, it seems like. It's very strange. All this, everything we're talking about here seems stopped in time. It's all happened, seems, in very slow-mo, very slow motion. And yet all we're talking about happened in the space of a few hours. But then they gave up on this news conference. Oswald was wanting to make a speech. He wasn't answering any of the questions. It was sort of a joke. So we kept hanging around. Through the course of the evening, they brought in the rifle that they had found here, right downstairs, and we all took pictures of it. We phoned that in. They brought in his mother and his wife, Marina. He had given his address as Mrs. Payne's address out in Irving, which is where his wife, who was a Russian, was staying. They were separated. He would go out sometimes on the weekend. They'd searched her house. They'd searched here. So they brought in Marina Olding and Mrs. Oswald, who had nothing to say except, Lee's a good boy. The mother of all murderers insists, my son's a good boy. And finally, just before midnight, they charged him with the murder of John F. Kennedy. And it's important to remember there was no federal law against killing a president at that time. There was a federal law against threatening the life of a president. You could go into federal court for that. But for actually killing a president, there was no federal law on the books. So this was going to be the state of Texas versus Lee Harvey Oswald in the murder of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But everybody was waiting for that final word that he had been charged with the assassination. And it came just before midnight. And I remember I raced down to a phone. Again, reporters were grabbing phones out of detectives' hands, trying to get outside lines to phone in all this information that was coming out. We were reporting every little thing that happened. And the bosses back at the office would sort it out and edit it, and they'd write the running stories, as Jack Fallon was writing the running story throughout all this. And I got to the phone. This very kindly police detective had sort of taken pity on me, I guess maybe because I was so young, and also maybe because I was from Texas, and he was hearing from a lot of English and French and German reporters demanding this and demanding that. And anyway, he said, I got a phone here for you. And it was sitting on the desk in front of a man by the name of another reporter, whom I later learned was Tom Wicker of the New York Times, but I didn't know who it was at the time. Anyway, he said, what is it? And I said, well, I've just charged Oswald with killing the president. And he said, he knew I was UPI, and he said, you phone it in, they'll get it quicker from you than from me. And so I grabbed the phone and phoned it in. And there was confusion later elsewhere around the world. A lot of people said, oh, he wasn't charged until the next day, but that's only because it was just before midnight here, and it was just before 1 a.m. in New York. And so it was, and I stayed on there for a couple more hours that night, and then finally went home. And beginning of a big weekend. But
I want to make sure we leave a few minutes for audience questions. If you filled out question cards, if you'll pass those to the end of your rows, we'll collect those and go through as many as we can. Bill, about 35 years after the assassination, you wrote a book, a young adult book, about the assassination, about your experiences that weekend. And as I mentioned at the start, you've had a long career in journalism with the New York Times. We're here at the half-century mark of the Kennedy assassination. As someone who has covered a lot of news stories over the years, give us a sense of how news coverage in general, particularly print versus television, has changed in the last 50 years.
Well, it has changed enormously. It was a sea change, and it really happened that weekend. It really began almost the day of the assassination. I remember you mentioned that at the time that Malcolm Kilduff made the announcement that the president had died, and Smitty was standing there, and the TV was setting up. We knew that this was going to be the announcement. Everybody sort of knew this was it. And so a TV man with a tripod was beginning to set up his camera. Again, I have to remind everybody, anyone young enough, that there weren't any camcorders then. You had to plug in a TV, you had to take film, and it had to be transmitted. And so he accidentally bumped into Merriman Smith. And Smitty turned, and he sort of shoved him a little bit, and he said, move that somewhere else, we've got to get this. And the camera guy picked up his tripod and moved it over about 3 feet. And that is probably the last time in the history of American journalism that a camera was moved at the behest of a print journal, of a reporter. It was very important that weekend. A lot of people think they saw the assassination on television, but it wasn't. It was Zapruder's 8mm movie film, which has been shown over and over. There wasn't much television coverage until the next day, when cameras could be set up. But it became, everybody that was alive then and that can remember it would probably remember you were absolutely glued to the television that whole weekend, watching everything that happened. And through television, this entire country was able to attend the lying in state, to watch all the other dignitaries walk by that casket, that bier in the rotunda. The entire nation was able to attend the funeral of our fallen president. They almost walked with Jackie behind as she walked ahead of that whole line of kings and presidents and chiefs of state, watched as the horse with the reversed boots on it galloped down Pennsylvania Avenue, followed the hearse, was there. The entire nation was able to take part in it. And from that weekend on, television really became the predominant source of news for most Americans. And it is now, over decades, become to the point where hardly anybody reads a newspaper anymore. A lot of people still take them, but American journalism really changed that weekend and set it on a course to what it is now, and it has changed a great deal. I'll mention one other thing. It's changed in journalism as well. We've gotten to the point now where we have television stations that try to offer news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there's just not enough going on in the world to capture interest. So it's become, news itself has become something different. Celebrity, whatever celebrity can do, fill an hour. Of course, the big stories can still carry 24 hours worth of news. But it's also changed in a way, and I'll go back to something I said earlier, that when they were about to announce the president was dead, when I came in with the news that the priest had said that he seemed to be dead, Jack Fallon, UPI wasn't going to go with that as official. They had to have it immediately from the hospital or from the White House. Today you'll find television news reporting rumors, anything they pick up. They can always correct it 20 minutes later and say, oh, well, that proved to be false. But in those days, there was no saying at UPI, you had to get it first, but first you had to get it right. And I think that journalism has lost a bit in that area, because you tune into TV and you'll just hear any group. I remember when Reagan was shot, and I won't identify the network. One of the network reporters said that Reagan was dead. And he then identified, he said, we've just heard this from a Senate page who was in the lobby of the hospital. A Senate page in the lobby of the hospital. I mean, this would have never happened. Walter Cronkite would have never announced that Reagan was dead. And of course they had to correct it 15 or 20 minutes later. As we all know, Reagan lived and survived and served another term. So I think journalism has both gained and lost with the advent of television being the prime source for all news. And the competition to be ahead has lost the primary tenet of journalism, which is the factual truth. And anyway, that's one of the things that happened that weekend.
Let's take a few questions from the audience. As you can imagine, there are several in here that ask pretty much the same question, and you know exactly what I'm going to ask you. Do you think there was a conspiracy in the murder of President Kennedy?
No, I don't at all. Anytime I appeared with the book or any other program, we did a lot of about the only time I did investigative journalism. My career later, I was a foreign correspondent for a number of years and covered a couple of wars and a couple of other assassinations. But often I'm asked about this particularly. I believe that what came out officially is pretty much what happened, and I should give 2 or 3 reasons for that. The first reason is that if there was a real conspiracy, it would have had to be put together in about 36 hours, because the first time that the actual motorcade route that the president was going to take in Dallas was published, was known to anyone, was in the Wednesday afternoon Dallas Times-Herald, which published a little map showing where the motorcade in Dallas would be on Friday. Lee Oswald saw that on Wednesday afternoon, decided to go out to Mrs. Payne's house in Irving on Thursday. He hardly ever went out except on the weekends. And so it was a surprise for all of them that he went out on Thursday and picked up his gun and came back in on Friday when he realized that it was going to pass here. Lee Oswald himself got the job here before there was even an itinerary for a presidential trip to Texas. So that would have just hadn't have been luck. Another thing, and this is even probably more important to me, every conspiracy theory I've heard, and I've heard just about all of them, that it was the mafia, that it was organized labor, the Teamsters, that it was Cuba, and actually the Soviet Union was behind, or the Fair Play for Cuba, which Oswald was part of it. I've heard that Lyndon Johnson may have been part of it, that it was the Secret Service. I could go on and on. I've heard them all. Any conspiracy theory I've heard would involve at a very minimum another 10, 12, 15 people to be involved. Some of them would involve 50 to 100, really organized thing. In my experience as a journalist, it's hard enough for two people to keep a secret. You get a third person in, and one of them's bound to blab it at some point. But if you get a dozen, let's say a very minimum of a dozen people involved, including it had been one or two Secret Service people or whatever, somebody at some point is going to talk about their role in the conspiracy. We've gone 50 years now, and I've never heard any credible theory that would involve anyone other than Lee Harvey Oswald.
Another question for you. Did you know Jack Ruby?
I did not know Jack Ruby. I felt like I knew Jack Ruby. In the days immediately following the assassination, for the next week or two, obviously the story moved to Washington except for the follow-up stories. And about the only time I've ever done any investigative reporting in my career came in those weeks immediately afterwards. We started trying to trace every movement that Lee Harvey Oswald had made almost since the time he came back from Dallas. And especially after he was killed himself, Jack Ruby. And I discovered, actually, that prior to Oswald's residence at the time of the assassination, which was on Beckley, he had lived for a little over a week at a rooming house on Marsalis. At the time, Jack Ruby was also living at one of those sort of motel-type apartment buildings, also on Marsalis, just where the expressway came by. It was one of those $9 a night motel-type things that also rented by the hour, I think. And it was only about eight blocks or so from where Oswald was living at the time. So I talked with the woman that ran that rooming house quite a bit, and also the guy that ran the, did Oswald ever have any visitors? Did anybody ever come to see him? Did he go for a walk in the evenings? Did he ever meet anybody? Did he, anything? Did he ever, what other phone calls did he make? And about the only phone calls that he made from that rooming house were to Irving, to his wife, and as a matter of fact, the woman heard him speaking in this foreign language. She wasn't sure what it was, but she later learned it was Russian, and she wasn't about to have anybody who spoke Russian living in her rooming house, so she asked him to leave, and that was when he got the other room on Beckley. But he never went out in the evening. No one ever came to see him during the time he was there. This is just one of the little steps that I interviewed Mrs. Payne several times, and she had never heard of Jack Ruby. As far as we could tell, I didn't know Jack Ruby, and neither did Lee Harvey Oswald. So,
we have time for one more question, and I think this is particularly interesting. Do you remember any female reporters covering the assassination alongside you?
Alongside me? No, I don't. There were a couple of women reporters in the White House press corps. Again, I have to emphasize that I was a very young cub reporter for UPI in Dallas, so I didn't know hardly anyone in the White House press corps. As a matter of fact, when I got to the Parkland, I just mentioned this briefly, I was told to find Merriman Smith, and I'd talked to him twice now on the phone, but I didn't know what he looked like. And so I went up I saw one of the people with a White House press corps badge, and I said, I'm Bill Hampton, UPI, I'm trying to find Merriman Smith, can you point him out to me? And the guy looked at me and he said, you're a reporter, you find him. And I looked at his little name tag, it was Jack Bell of the AP. He had just lost the fight for the phone in the car. But so I didn't notice any in that crowd. There was a lot of us milling around outside the emergency area. Then then I ran around the front, and then by the time they made the announcement, they also made a similar announcement for most of the White House press corps to get on buses because the President Johnson was going to be sworn in aboard Air Force One by District Judge Sarah Hughes. I ran the phone that in. That was big news, obviously, and so I didn't really notice any. I'm sure there must have been. There were 2 or 3 women in the White House press corps at the time. It's interesting. We did not have a woman reporter in UPI office, and I know the AP didn't either. There were a lot of women reporting for journalists for both Dallas newspapers at the time. And when I got to New York with UPI later, there were quite a lot of women reporters there. But on the day of the assassination, if there were any, I didn't see any, but I'm sure there must have been. Later on, for Ruby's trial, some very top New York women reporters came down. Dorothy Kilgallen came down, was rather famous. She made a big thing about when she had to be searched by going into the courthouse. But I don't know. It's an interesting question, and I don't recall seeing any that day. No, there must have been some.
Well, that's all the time we have for this program. Mr. Hampton will be at a table over in the corner there to sign books and meet you and answer other questions if you have it. But for right now, please join me in thanking him for sharing his story today. Thank you.